These mics are very specific.
Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Joint Airport Zoning Board. It's 3 o'clock, more or less, PM on Tuesday, October 25th, 2022. We're located in the New Ulm City Hall Council Chambers. First item of business is the approval of the minutes of the July 20th, 2022 meeting. Are there any corrections or amendments to those minutes?
No.
If not, a motion would be in order.
I move.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the meeting minutes from July 20th, 2022. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Next item of business is under old business is to consider the adoption of revisions to the airport safety zoning ordinance for the New Ulm Municipal Airport. I believe, Mr. Page, you are going to give a report on this particular item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Keep it pretty short and sweet today. The purpose of today's discussion is to update the board on where we are with the overall process. Again, I am Brian Page. I am the consultant assisting the City of New Ulm with the airport zoning updates. So with that, last time we met was for the first public hearing, which is a required part of the overall process. We went through that first public hearing, and during the hearing, if some of you recall, there was a question that came up from at least one of the landowners with a concern about some definitions about what could occur on the individual private properties that were in some of the areas to be zoned. And one of the concerns is there are properties out there, particularly in the Zone B, which is at the south end of the airport. There was some concerns out there that there's properties and residences out there that are certainly in compliance with the zoning requirements currently. But one of the concerns is, hey, if we have a family gathering and that gathering exceeds basically that persons to the size of the site ratio, are we going to be in trouble if it's an occasional gathering or get-together? So on the heels of doing that and working with the city attorney and Joe, we had come up and crafted some language to try to come up with a way to be able to allow that. And essentially, if you look, the addition that was made to Section 3, there was this new definition that talks a little bit about site population. That is new. That was actually added to the draft ordinance to be able to solve that issue. And what it says is the number of permanent residents on a residential property or the maximum number of persons who are regularly present at the same time on a non-residential property. So we actually have both sides of it covered. We have the residential side and we have the commercial side. So that is the purpose of that discussion and that definition that was added to the zoning update. And this has been reviewed by the folks at the state and MnDOT, and they didn't take any exception to that definition. So this was more or less just a clarification based on the first public hearing. Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you show us in the ordinance where the term then site population is used?
It's actually used in the definitions. I don't have that before me. I don't know if we have one of the previous presentations, but essentially it's in the definition of what's allowed in Zone B. And essentially what it talks about is it talks about various different populations in there, and it doesn't really give a firm definition as to what you're meaning by site population. Now, the intent from the state is to make sure that this is something that's not going to be a hazard to the airport by creating a situation that creates a gathering of people, more or less on a routine basis. Like you have a certain number of people that either live there, and like a multifamily, type of a complex of some kind, or if you had a business, a commercial business, that was perhaps, I guess, exceeding that site ratio. So,
Okay, I believe I've found it on page 13 of the
correct.
Ordinance. And
And it's actually, Mr. Chairman, under 3B, which says that each use shall not create, attract, or bring together a site population that would exceed 15 times that of the site acreage. And again, the table that's down below in that definition actually shows the different sites that we're talking about, but by and large, most of the residential sites that are out in that neighborhood are essentially 3 acres plus or minus.
right. So that means that 45 people is the maximum, or is they're permitted to exceed that 45-person limitation?
As long as it's not a routine type situation, like say, for instance, you had 45 people living there. Or on the other hand, say it was a business, although there are no businesses out there, but if it were to be a business that you had at any given shift, that you have more than 45 on at any given shift.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions regarding that?
I don't.
Okay.
So again, today's purpose is really to kind of talk through some of these changes that came about in the process, and this is the first one that came about as part of the public hearing. Happy to report, after that first public hearing, we took the draft, sent that out to MnDOT for the commissioner's approval, and that's where they kind of came back with a couple of comments to us that they wanted some things clarified. There was just a quick typo that was actually on one of the pages in there that essentially started one of the surfaces. The drawing was correct, but in the definition of the surface, I didn't put that in the presentation here, but there was one definition that, for some strange reason, some of the language carried on to the primary runway and defined the primary runway with the primary surface beginning at the end of the runway, which it doesn't. It begins 200 feet from the end of the runway. So we did have to clarify that. That was more or less just a procedural change or a typo that somehow that language ended up kind of carrying through from the paragraph that preceded the one that we're talking about. But then the second change actually pertained to a section 11, which is talking about the airport zoning administrator. And I've got it up on the screen now, and I'd like to point out that the language that you see that's highlighted in red and stricken was the original language as it went to MnDOT for the commissioner's approval and review. The green language is what they came back and recommended that we change it to as a procedural thing. And one of the reasons for doing that is when and this is really, the section is actually pertaining to if somebody comes to the airport zoning board and requests some sort of a change or a variance or any permit that's going to happen inside any of the zoned areas. And they just want to make it clear that the first point is actually going to go to, as this section is titled, is going to go to the airport zoning administrator first. And the airport zoning administrator is defined as the community development director. So that's going to be the first person that's going to see these permits and these requests for variances that come in. And then it'll be up to the zoning administrator and/or, I guess, the community development director to review that and then either grant permission or deny it. And then once that happens, that same person will have to send that information on to the governing body, which would be the board, for a final determination as to whether or not they agree with it, And particularly if they don't agree with it, then there's another procedural step in the later sections that were identified. But this was just a procedural change, just reason being is we wanted to clarify to have this match more closely to what the state template actually shows. So as it was before, this was gonna go to the planning commission body as a whole, and then they were gonna make that decision, and then it was gonna go on to the board after that, and the state did not like that. So they said, we wanna keep that back to the zoning administrator making that decision.
Okay, let me just repeat what I thought I understood you to say. So the community development director makes a decision on a request. He either grants it or denies it. And then his decision goes to the planning commission for their approval.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's essentially how this would be broken out. Now, the planning commission, as was determined and as is identified and defined earlier in the document, is the planning commission. So again, the terminology, you gotta kind of keep track of what it is, but essentially the zoning administrator is the community development director, and the board of adjustment, is the planning commission.
Okay.
So that was the other change, and again, these are two relatively benign changes. And we have been told by the folks down at MnDOT, if the JASB accepts these changes, the next step will be is they're gonna put it right before the commissioner for that final approval. If the approval is granted with no exceptions going forward, provided all these are made, we are told that the second public hearing will not be required. So the next step would be going through the process. You can kind of see the things kind of checked off the list here. The next step would be is to submit the revisions off to MnDOT for the approval. Once that takes place, then if the commissioner has any comments that are something that they feel that the public is going to need to be aware of, then we would have to schedule that second public hearing. But right now, it's not likely that's going to happen. So then the next step would be is adopting, this body would adopt the ordinance. And then the process would be essentially complete.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Page about either the proposed revisions or the proposed schedule going forward?
No, I don't.
Okay. So then, if I understand correctly, it's our responsibility to approve the zoning ordinance with the proposed revisions.
Yes,
That would be the action that we are being asked to take.
yes.
So if there's not anything else, we should have a motion to that effect. If that's,
I'll move it.
okay, we have a move to adopt the revisions to the airport safety zoning ordinance for the New Ulm Municipal Airport. Do we have a second?
I second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
Aye.
If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Okay. The next item of business then is that our next meeting date will be scheduled, I guess, following the commissioner's approval of the ordinance. So as a body, we will meet at least one additional time,
Yes.
and then perhaps at that point conclude our term.
Yep. Essentially a resolution to adopt essentially the zoning update at that point. And then once that takes place, that will conclude the process.
Okay. Any further questions, comments? If not so, I guess we stand adjourned.
Thank you.